Chapter 3. Otjimbingwe is well situated for a missionary station. Water, the first necessary of life, is here in sufficient quantity, as a small streamlet runs down the bed of the river. Grass, the next essential in the eyes of a pastoral people like the Damaras, is also in abundance, for the Swekop at this place, instead of lying between abrupt cliffs, runs through a wide plain that shelves for miles down its bed, and which, though covered with thorn bushes, affords a fair allowance of grass-bearing soil. The mission house was a temporary affair, a mud wall 6 feet high, and over it a round tented ceiling of matwork, in shape like a wagon roof. A gigantic house was being built by Mr. Rath, the missionary, on the top of a little cliff close by. Mr. Rath and his wife received me with great kindness, and as this place, or its neighborhood, was to be my headquarters for some time, I chose my encampment with some deliberation. It was among a group of fine trees and close by a good spring of water. The natives about the station were excessively annoying and troublesome, and I was strongly inclined to make an example of some of them. But I still followed a pacific policy. When my encampment had been planned and the tent pitched and bushes placed in a wide circle round the cart, I went to spend the evening with the missionary and to hear the news of the country. The first intelligence shocked me very much. It was that quite recently the neighboring Namakwa Hottentots had attacked Schmelin's Hope, 3 long days' journey ahead, had murdered and mutilated the Damaras that lived there, and, naturally enough, terrified the resident missionary into leaving the place. The cause of this outrage, as far as I could learn, was simply savage barbarism, a little robbery, and a demonstration of dislike to the missionary cause. I mentioned, at the beginning of the book, the name of Yonka Afrikaner as the most important man among the Hottentots. It was he who headed the expedition. The effect of this attack, which had occurred after a long peace or pause from fighting, was to frighten every Damara who had cattle to lose into the far interior, so that hardly an ox was grazing within 2 days' journey north of the Swakop, and to seriously alarm the missionaries, who had hitherto depended on these very Hottentots for protection from Damara insult. The Damaras that I saw were paupers who had no cows, people who chiefly lived not on milk, but on roots like pig nuts, and who collected round a white man with a vague hope of protection from him against their countrymen. I determined to start immediately for Barmen, the head seat of intelligence as regards Damara and Hottentot movements, and called upon Hans the next morning to get, not horsed, but oxed for the journey. I found him in the neatest of encampments, with an old sail stretched in a sailor-like way to keep the sun off, and in an enclosure of thick reeds that were cut and hedged all round. The floor was covered with sheepskin mats. Shooting things, knick-knacks, and wooden vessels were hung on the forked branches of the sticks that propped up the whole. A very intelligent English lad was acting as his help. Natives squatted round at a respectful distance, and Hans sat on an ottoman, looking like a mogul. I had some conversation with him, and saw at once that he was not only willing to accompany me, but that also he was the very man I wanted. I had heard but one opinion of his efficiency and honesty from the Europeans that I had seen, which satisfied me on those points. And the style of the man was exactly what I desired, for he was quiet, sedate, but vigorous and powerfully framed, showing in all his remarks the shrewdest common sense, and evidently from the order around him an excellent disciplinarian. We very soon came to terms, which were that he should go with me to Barmen on trial, and that, if we suited, I would employ him as head servant. I was strongly urged to make a good enclosure, kraal, for mules and men, as the lions were extremely numerous about the low ground, in which I had encamped for the sake of the shade, though they seldom prowled upon the bare cliff on which Hans and the Damara huts were scattered. I therefore collected all the natives together that I could, and set vigorously to work, cutting down all the bushes I could find to strengthen my kraal with, and 2 days passed very busily. I then left Anderson in charge and rode on with Stewartson and Hans towards Barmen in the afternoon of the 2nd day. Our little caravan consisted entirely of Hans's animals, for all of mine required rest. Besides our ride oxen, we had 1 ox packed and 1 loose, 3 sheep, and 2 Damaras. Our pace was a jog trot, and the Damaras drove the sheep and 2 oxen in front, while we rode behind and drove on the Damaras. We off-packed after 3 hours, but it was dark when we did so, and the sheep ran loose and we could not drive them in together. One ran quite away and was eaten, I presume, by the hyenas who disturbed us a good deal. One we killed and the other we tied to a bush. Hans made me a much more comfortable bed than I had previously enjoyed, showing me how to cut the bushes and make a dead hedge of them. Then he smoothed the ground and, plucking dry grass, strewed it thickly about. Upon that he laid 2 or 3 sheepskins, over them my mackintosh, and lastly my eiderdown quilt. This had become torn to rags by the thorns, and I intended on the first opportunity to get a kaross instead of it. Sheepskins and karosses are no encumbrance in traveling with pack-oxen, for they are carefully placed under the saddlebags, and their use in keeping the animals back from being galled is more than compensation for their weight. I listened with much interest to Hans's tales and anecdotes. He had been the most successful sportsman in the country, and had lived the last 2 or 3 years in sole charge of an immense drove of oxen, once amounting to 700, with only 1 or 2 native lads to help him in the care of them. He had shot a great many lions out of the Swakop, 6 in the preceding year, and made it a much safer place than it used to be to drive cattle in. From his account, that riverbed must have swarmed with game when it was first seen by Europeans, but I can easily fancy, from the confined character of the country, how in a short time 1 or 2 guns would entirely exterminate them. In the morning, our remaining sheep could not be driven. He was too scared, and as time was much more precious than mutton, we killed him, took out his inside, and strapped him across one of the oxen with hardly any delay. I was well mounted on an old ox and really liked his walking pace very much. I think I can sit more hours on ox back than on horseback, supposing in both cases the animals to walk. An ox's jog trot is not very endurable, but anything faster abominable. The peculiarity of the creature is that he will not go alone, from his disposition being so very gregarious. He is distressed beyond expression when any attempt succeeds for a time in separating him from the herd. It is with great difficulty that an ox can be found willing to go ahead of the others, even though he knows that his fellows are just behind him. Whipping and spurring has hardly any effect on the animal. He feels every cut most sensitively, as the rider cannot but be aware of, but the obstinacy of his nature is so wonderfully great that pain has little or no influence upon his determination. His character is totally different from that of a horse, and very curious to observe. He is infinitely the more sagacious of the two, but never free from vice. The gregariousness of oxen and of sheep is of great advantage to the traveller, for it is not necessary to be perpetually counting the animals to see if any have strayed, and at night, when the oxen are all loose about him, a constant anxiety is taken off the owner's mind by knowing that if he sees one, all are there. My mules had given me a great deal of trouble by requiring much more watching than the oxen, and I hardly know how I could have travelled with a large drove of those animals. I should not dare to let them be loose at night, and the country seldom affords enough trees to tether them to. We made a tedious ride today, taking something to eat at noon and going on in the evening. I began to see that being able to endure severe exertion for half the day without the breakfast we always have in England was essential to our sort of life. At first it is very trying. In temperate climates it is easy enough, but in tropical ones, when you begin work in the fresh cool of the morning and become hungry and exhausted at the very time that the sun is beginning to blaze most powerfully, the want of a restorative is more particularly felt. It is impossible in practice to ensure breakfast before you start, and constantly when you least expect it. A series of accidents occur that keep you mounted and put it off till 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But coffee, so long as you have any, can always be made before starting. We passed over very broken ground and slept under some magnificent camel-thorn trees. The meat we killed in the morning seemed a little tainted, so we cooked as much as we could in our iron pot to prevent it from becoming worse, and gave all the rest to our 2 or 3 natives for a grand feast. The evening of the next day found us at Barman, which, if I was to avoid the Hottentots, would probably be the starting point of my exploring expedition. Mr. Hahn, a Russian by birth and married to an English lady, and a missionary of considerable influence, was the founder of this station. Mr. Kolber and his young wife, who had been attacked by the Hottentots at Schmalen's Hope, had come here for refuge. They had lost nearly everything. It seems they had quite recently occupied the place, and that the poorer natives had settled in great numbers by them. Kahikene, one of the 4 or 5 principal chiefs in Damara land, had also trekked there with many of his men and large herds of cattle. He had always behaved in a very friendly way to the missionaries. But this was the first time that either he or any of the influential Damaras had encamped within easy reach of a mission station. Kahikane showed no distrust, but lived in the friendliest relations with Mr. and Mrs. Kolb, and they had sincerely hoped by his means to get a firmer footing than they then had in Damara land. Just at this time, one night a troop of mounted Hottentots galloped up to the place, firing at and murdering all they could catch. Kahikane narrowly escaped. The Hottentots scoured the country in every direction, and a most fearful night was passed. In the early morning, Jonker came reeling drunk to the mission house, ordered the door to be unbarred, and behaved in the coolest way, demanded some breakfast and so forth, and then departed with his men and the oxen and what else they had robbed. It is very difficult to find out how many people are killed or wounded in occasions like these, as hyenas soon devour the dead bodies, and those who survive scatter in all directions, so that no clue remains towards the numbers missing. I saw 2 poor women, one with both legs cut off at her ankle joints, and the other with one. They had crawled the whole way on that eventful night from Schmalen's Hope to Barman, some 20 miles. The Hottentots had cut them off after their usual habit, in order to slip off the solid iron anklets that they wear. These wretched creatures showed me how they had stopped the blood by poking the wounded stumps into the sand. A European would certainly have bled to death under such circumstances. One of Jonker's sons, a hopeful youth, came to a child that had been dropped on the ground and who lay screaming there, and he leisurely gouged out its eyes with a small stick. I had no reason to think that this outrage on Mr. Kolb's station was any worse than the usual attacks that the Hottentots and Damaras make upon one another. But the Damaras are savages and are not supposed to know better, while Jonker is a British subject, born in the colony, and his best men are British subjects too. Missionaries and teachers in great numbers have been amongst them, or their fathers, for years and years, and the home of these people, though now they have trekked onto the tropics, is properly on the borders of the Orange River. I was very anxious to obtain something like an authentic history of these Hottentots and of the Damaras during the last few years, and I begged Mr. Hahn, who was eminently qualified to give me one, to do so. And as it will illustrate my story, I will now give it substance, mixed up and corrected with what I have since gathered from various quarters, or made out for myself. The agents in this history are Namaqua Erlams, or Namaquas born, in or near the colony, often having Dutch blood and a good deal of Dutch character in their veins. Among these, Jonker is a chief. The Namaqua Hottentots look at these Erlams with great jealousy and consider them almost as aliens. They do not approve of their intelligence and mixed blood, but nevertheless make common cause with them against the Damaras. It must be recollected that Hottentots are yellow and not at all black. I could pick out many complexions far fairer than that of my own sunburnt face among them. But the Damaras are quite dark, though their features are good and seldom of the Negro type. Earlham was a nickname given by Dutch colonists to the Hottentots that hung about their farms. It means a barren ewe, a creature good neither for breeding nor fattening, a worthless concern, one that gives trouble and yields no profit. However, all things are relative, and what these Earlhams were to the Dutchmen, that the Namaqua Hottentots are to the Earlhams. The Europeans that have visited the country between the latitudes of Angra Pequana and Barman are some 10 missionaries, the same number of traders, 5 or 6 runaway sailors who have acted as servants to these, and 2 travelling parties besides my own. The first was that of Sir James Alexander, who explored this country upwards from the Orange River 15 or 20 years ago, and whom the traders and missionaries followed. The other was that of Mr. Ruxton, the well-known American traveler who sailed to Walfish Bay, but was prevented by the traders that were there from entering further into the land, and who had to return in the same ship that brought him. There is no difference whatever between the Hottentot and the Bushman, who lives wild about the hills in this part of Africa, whatever may have been said or written on the subject. The Namaqua Hottentot is simply the reclaimed and somewhat civilized Bushman, just as the Earlhams represent the same raw material under a slightly higher degree of polish. Not only are they identical in features and language, but the Hottentot tribes have been, and continue to be, recruited from the Bushmen. The largest tribe of these Namaqua Hottentots, those under Cornelius, and who muster now 1,000 guns, have almost all of them lived the life of Bushmen. In fact, a savage loses his name, Cyan, which is the Hottentot word, as soon as he leaves his bushman's life and joins one of the larger tribes, as those at Walfish Bay have done. And therefore when I say Earlham Hottentot or Bushman, the identically same yellow, flat-nosed, woolly-haired, clicking individual must be conjured up before the mind of my kind reader, but differing in dirt, squalor, and nakedness, according to the actual term employed, the very highest point of the scale being a creature who has means of dressing himself respectably on Sundays and gala days, and who knows something of reading and writing. The lowest point, a regular savage. Of the very smallest tribe of Bushmen I met none in my travels. The Earlhams, then, some 30 years since, were near the Orange River, and Yonker was a chief of secondary importance amongst them. He fought his way into notoriety, and with success his little tribe received fresh recruits. The Namaqua Hottentots asked his assistance in attacking their northern neighbors, the Damaras, the pretext being constant quarrels, the ill treatment that their kindred the Bushmen were receiving throughout the country, and last, not least, the fine herds of oxen that only waited to be plundered. Yonker accordingly trekked up, helped the Hottentots, and then settled alongside of them. His tribe now became larger and more efficient. He bought guns and horses from the Cape with the oxen that he stole, and continued robbing the Damaras on his own account. In consequence of a representation sent by Sir James Alexander to 2 missionary societies, stations were formed at Yonker's headquarters, and in 1840 he had been so far influenced that he agreed to leave the Damaras at rest and to take care that the other Hottentots should do the same, for he had become by far the most important chief among them all. The way in which peace was made and kept for 3 years was highly creditable to the missionaries concerned in it. A great deal of trade was carried on in Yonker's Werft. A blacksmith's shop was put up there, and iron things, assegais, choppers for cutting wood, beads, and so forth, were made in great quantities and sold for cattle, which again were exchanged with traders from the Cape for clothes, guns, and such like things. But this did not long last. The traders sold their goods on credit. Yonker and the others became deeply in debt, and as the only way of paying it off involved themselves once again in the endless Damara quarrels. It appeared that one Damara chief and his tribe had been invited to a feast, and when these were attacked and nearly all killed, Yonker, after much persuasion, got a commando together to revenge the injured party, and started. Once on a raid, the Hottentots did not much care whom they attacked, and began by robbing a werft under Kashua, who had nothing to do with the matter in question, drove off their cattle, and rode after the natives, men, women, and children, shooting them down in all directions. This he repeated elsewhere till a large herd of cattle were brought together, and then he returned. Cornelius's tribe of Hottentots, hearing of Yonker's success, followed his example. They rode in a friendly way to one of Kahikane's villages, Mr. Kolbe's friend at Schmalen's Hope, and, as the Damaras were employed in bringing them milk after the usual fashion, they attacked them and massacred all they could. From this time up to the Schmalen's Hope affair, nothing else had occurred but fightings and retaliations between the Namaquas and Damaras. I have the details in full of many of them, but they are all alike, with little more than the name and place varied. The consequence is that although the Namaquas have no trade whatever with the Damaras, a steady export of Damara oxen goes on southwards to our colony in droves of from 200 to 800 head of cattle, which are bought here with far too little inquiry as to how they have been obtained. In fact, I am assured in every quarter that of late years the news of a trader's wagon being on the road has been the signal for a general raid upon the Damaras. Yonka had up to the present time acted very fairly, but rather despotically to all the whites. He had always protected their persons and property, and had often stood their friend against the other Hottentots. Even the Damara missionaries were greatly indebted to him for the security they enjoyed, for the belief was that any harm done to them would be instantly retaliated by the much-dreaded horsemen of the Hottentots. But Yonka liked to have his own way, and soon became heartily tired of advice and admonition, and more lately his plundering disposition and that of the Hottentots had become so thoroughly roused that the rebuking presence of the missionaries was felt to be extremely irksome and galling, and he constantly expressed his determination to rid himself of them. Still, they entertained no personal cause for alarm. But the attack on Schmelin's Hope had placed the matter on a different footing, and their position was become avowedly very perilous. The Damaras, from their suspicious nature, always believed the missionaries and other white people to be merely a species of Hottentot, and acting as spies to Yonka. They argue thus: you come and go without harm, passing through their country. You must therefore be as one of their people. And now that the Damaras had been killed all round Mr. Kolber, and he himself not murdered, they firmly believed that he went there merely as a decoy to bring Kahikane within Yonka's reach. There was nothing revolting in such a line of conduct in the Damara mind, for they seemed to have no perceptible notion of right and wrong, but it was considered to be a simple fact, and as such they acted upon it by entirely gutting the Schmelin's Hope House the instant that Mr. and Mrs. Kolb had made their hurried retreat from that place to Barman. Yonka had never, even when on the best terms with the whites, permitted any of them to enter Damara land. The traders were peremptorily refused permission to go there, and more lately, when Mr. Hahn had got everything in readiness at Barman to explore the interior, a troop of men were sent who drove away all his ride, pack, and wagon oxen, and detained them till the season for travelling was gone by, the reason being that if a free intercourse were established between the whites and Damara land, the Damaras would soon buy guns and weapons, which would place them on more equal terms with the Hottentots. It can easily then be conceived with what temper Yonka and the others had heard of my landing and intention to explore. A plan of sending men down to Wolfish Bay and to cut me off there was, as I found out afterwards, publicly discussed. Help or countenance from the Damaras was the last thing I could expect, for they would treat me as a Hottentot, and again, my men were so totally undisciplined and devoid of pluck, and had already cast back so many longing regrets towards the Cape, that I felt that the least check in the first instance to my success would dash the whole enterprise. At the Cape, my plans had already been thwarted by the emigrant Boers, who chose to cut off all communication with the north by the one side of the Karikari Desert, and here were the Earlhams, their offset as it were, trying to do the same on the other. The cases were as similar as could be. Both parties were guided by British subjects. Both were effectually barring out civilization and commerce from Central Africa. And what I felt most peculiarly vexatious, both were barring out me. Now, when I was in Cape Town, there was a very general feeling that the interior of South Africa would become an extensive and open field for colonial commerce, since the discovery of Lake Ngami had shown a way to it. Hence, it was doubly annoying that the emigrant Boers, whose treatment of the blacks was not very many shades better than that of the Earlhams, should not only keep us from these countries, but also generate a hatred on the part of the blacks against white faces, which years of intercourse on our part might not efface. His Excellency, the Governor, guided by these views, took advantage of my intended expedition, and also of Mr. Oswell's, who was then in the neighborhood of Lake Ngami, by formally requesting each of us to establish friendly relations on the part of the Cape government with the black tribes who were subject to the attacks of these marauders. We were simply to convey expressions of goodwill and strong assurances that the proceedings of the Boers met with no countenance on the part of the colony. I, therefore, knowing that Yonker still felt some fear of and respect for the Cape government, wrote him a long letter in legible characters, which I was assured could be deciphered by some of his people. I told him how much displeasure the emigrant Boers had caused, that his actions were as bad as theirs, and that therefore he would probably be regarded with the same displeasure as they, if he persisted in attacking the Damaras now that he had been warned. I ended with an assurance that I should call the Damara chiefs together and express to them what I had been requested to do in the case of the nations threatened by the emigrant Boers. After I had written my letter in English, I had it translated into simple Dutch and written on a magnificent sheet of paper and, finding a messenger, sent it by him to Yonker, who lived 50 miles off, under a high range of hills which was distinctly visible from Barmen. Mr. Hans spoke highly of Hans and strongly advised me not only to take him into my service, but also to buy up his stock of oxen and sheep, as it would save me infinite trouble. And this I did. I paid him by cheque on Cape Town £71 for 50 oxen and 100 sheep and goats. Of these, about 15 were more or less trained, and 2 or 3 were ride oxen. It was the best bargain I could possibly have made, for a month's barter among the Damaras would never have bought so many. The poverty of the land began to strike me, and the extreme inconvenience of having no currency, which makes bartering a very different matter from buying at a shop. I was grieved, too, to find that very many of my articles of exchange were ill-chosen and worthless, and also that I should require a very large troop of slaughter oxen, as hardly any game seemed to exist in this part of the country. I only stayed 1 whole day at Barmen, and then returned to my cart at Otjimbingwe, riding the 60 miles between the 2 places in a day and a half, which is very fair travelling for an ox. I found everything in order under Anderson's management. I heard that the night I left them, some lions were roaring in the most awful manner close round the encampment. They seemed to be trying to get at the mules, who luckily did not break loose. The men were excessively frightened, as well they might be, for they could see nothing in the dark night, and the lions could at any moment have leaped over the slight fence into the midst of them. The morning showed their spoors, as they had crawled round, and close to the bushes that made the fence. Hans was now formally installed in his office, and the breaking in of the new oxen for the wagons began. Yokes were borrowed from the missionary, and a heavy tree felled for the animals to draw. The first ox that we lassoed by the leg was very vicious. He threw himself down and broke his thigh bone, and I had to shoot him. The next sprained his ankle, and then got savage and chased everybody, running upon 3 legs. He at length took refuge among some thick dabby bushes, which were thronged with hornets, and, what between the mad charges of the animal and the stings of the hornets, we were fairly beaten off, and had to leave him the whole day by himself. This was a bad beginning, but after infinite labour 3 or 4 were inspanned. They were caught, then made fast between 2 tame oxen, and they're yoked. The same operation was repeated for a few days, but we did not make much progress. The animals were so very fresh and vicious. It must be recollected that Damara cattle are far wilder animals than those we see in England, and infinitely more difficult to break in. There is a game-like and thoroughbred look about them. Many of them will face and charge a lion, as a buffalo would. My ride-ox, Friesland, who had once been badly scratched and bitten, became furious if he heard a lion's cry near him. Hans suggested driving them down to the bay, and then, when a little tired by the journey and accustomed to having a number of white men about them, they would be more submissive. I decided on trying this plan, and an early day was fixed for the start. In the meantime, we had ceased to stare at the strangeness of our new friends, the Damaras. Numbers came to my kraal every day to look in at us in a friendly manner and to see if there was anything for them to pilfer. Timbu began to make himself intelligible to them, and was quite delighted at each word or phrase that he found to be the same as in his own language. The mules and horses were just recovering their condition when that fatal scourge, the distemper, broke out amongst them. First, one fine mule was found to be ill and to stand with difficulty. A little froth gathered about his nose and mouth. In an hour he was lying on the ground, and in another hour dead. I was distressed beyond measure, as I knew the disease would not rest with him. Neither did it. 2 more mules were infected, and died also, but my last horse still was in good health. He gave me one good gallop after a giraffe. I saw him far off, coming down the long slope on the other side of the river, and cantered round him. As I got nearer and rode gently, I passed two other individuals, each stalking the same beast. One was my faithful Hans, and the other a brute of a lion. I galloped up to the giraffe and put a large bullet through his ribs, which sickened him at once. I then rode in front of him as he slowly kept on his road at a pace between a walk and a trot. But when I began to reload, I found to my intense disgust that my powder horn had jolted out of my pocket. I could not turn the giraffe. He forged steadily on at about 7 miles an hour, and as the evening was closing in, I had to leave him to go where he pleased. I offered a good reward for my powder flask, which I could not easily spare, and men, women, and boys ran off the next day on my horse's spoor and found it. I never carried a powder flask loose in my pocket again. Other Damaras followed and got my giraffe for themselves. In return for the meat of the dead mules, the Damaras worked at strengthening my kraal, building me a hut in it and digging a well. I had logs of wood or branches of trees planted upright in the ground at intervals all round, and plenty of dabby bushes wattled in between them. I made a good gate to the hole, for I wished to feel that when Timbu, John Mortar, and I remained behind, and the rest of the party were gone down to the bay to fetch the wagons, I might have a place of security against pilferers and night marauders. When the holes had to be dug for planting the uprights, I was infinitely amused at the adroitness with which the Damaras made them. I should have used spades, and, in default of those, I really do not know what I should have done, but the natives each took a common stick, pointed at one end, and holding it like a dagger, broke up the ground with it. They then scratched out the loose earth with their left hand, working in this way until holes were burrowed deeper than the elbow, and only some 6 inches in diameter. Savages have so many occasions for scratching up the ground, as in digging for deep roots, for water, when the wells are partly choked up, and such like, that the Damaras often carry a stick for the purpose among their arrows, in their quiver. The Bushmen do the same, and this method of digging is called in Dutch patois crowing the ground. Thus, crow water means water that you have to crow for, and not an open well or spring. To return to my horse. The day arrived when he was doomed, and the fatal distemper made him its last victim. It appears that distemper is most fatal in the months of September, October, and November, and that it generally ceases with the first rains. The Hottentots were hardly able to contend with it at first, but by degrees places were found in the Hottentot country, one on a high table mountain, where the sickly season could be passed by them in safety. Some few horses had had the distemper and recovered, and these were kept at hand. Yonker had always a few of these about him. The exchange price of a horse among the Hottentots here is from 8 to 10 oxen, but they were hardly ever sold, as a horse is invaluable for marauding purposes. Cattle cannot be swept off by a few men without their aid, for as soon as the attack is made, the oxen run off in all directions, and it is quite out of the power of a man on foot to overtake and turn them, but they are quite at the mercy of a few horsemen. There were large herds of zebras about that came down nearly every afternoon to drink, but I soon gave over trying to shoot them. It here required a very long stalk, as the broad open riverbed had first to be crossed, and there were 4 or 5 hangers-on about the place with their guns, who would run down and have their shots. Besides these, there were savages with their bows and arrows. Often, after an hour's hard and careful maneuvering, the game was seen to be startled, and a ball from a zealous sportsman was whizzing at them from some ridiculous distance. The captain of the werft made good and steady bags of game with his bow and arrows, getting a zebra about every other day. But then he had to slave at it, and often follow the wounded animal's spoor for great distances. The lions also killed several, and they supplied the natives pretty well. The Damaras were always on the lookout, and guided by the vultures, appropriated in the morning whatever beasts the lions had left half-eaten. I employed myself in breaking in my remaining mules to carry packs and saddles. They were too few now to draw my cart, but use might be made of them in some other way. They were troublesome, sensible creatures, not kicking at random, but always with an aim. We had several tumbles, but succeeded in teaching them the elements of their duty. It is much more difficult to break in animals in the open country than it is in an enclosure because when you let them go, which you cannot help doing sometimes, they gallop off, and it takes a very long time, often an hour and plenty of running, to turn and catch them again. Besides this, each chase scares and frightens them all the more. 8 days had now passed since I had returned from Barman, and a fortnight since the cart first arrived here in Otjimbingwe. The time had been spent pretty actively. A great deal had been learnt. One very bad character weeded from among my men, and on the evening of the 9th day, all the party, except Timbu, John Mortar, and myself, went down under the care of Anderson to the wagons. They took all the oxen and a sufficiency of slaughter sheep with them, the remainder being in charge of John Allen, the English lad whom I found living with Hans and doing work for him. John Allen was not yet in my service, but I engaged him afterwards. He was a most trustworthy, hard-working, clever lad, and originally a sailor. There was now no anxiety about the food and safety of the bay party, for Hans knew every inch of the road and was thoroughly au fait in all that related to oxen, but I did anticipate with much fear that the animals would never be broken in within any reasonable time. Everybody prophesied ill, but they had done so from the beginning, and I felt convinced that the hardest part of the journey, the first step, was over. I now had an establishment of oxen and men, and a few good servants amongst them, and it was precisely in possessing myself of an establishment that my great difficulty had lain. There was a ride-ox for every man that went to the bay, and they trotted off on the evening of October 17th. Stewardson went back with them. I was very sorry to part with him, as he had been an amusing comrade and of great service to me. My proposed expedition to Erongo had therefore to be postponed, and I determined to go there on Hans's return. I now lived in great part at Mr. Rath's house, copying his dictionary of Damara words, and hearing the results of his observations on the people. Timbu continued learning the language, and I waited with anxiety for an answer from Yonka. The time passed pleasantly enough. I put my map of the country so far as I had gone into order, practiced a good deal with my sextant, but made very little progress indeed in the language. I could find no pleasure in associating and trying to chat with these Damaras. They were so filthy and disgusting in every way, and made themselves very troublesome. My mules were watched and taken out to graze by 2 natives, whom I fed and paid at the rate of a yard of iron wire per month. After a time, no reply having arrived from Yonka, I engaged a Hottentot, who had 4 or 5 trained oxen, to take me to Barman. He was a respectable old gentleman who spoke Dutch perfectly, and every now and then earned something by doing odd jobs for the missionaries. His honesty was unimpeachable, his family large. The ladies of it were thoroughly Hottentot, and the younger ones were dressed in leather skirts that showed off their peculiar shapes to great advantage. Half of my things were put on oxback, half on the mules. Timbu and I rode an ox and a mule between us. John Mortar got a mount now and then, but he disliked both animals exceedingly. The mule curved his back and cocked his ears and switched his tail much more than was pleasant among the sharp rocks and abominable hakis thorns. These hakis thorns have overspread the whole country on this side of Tsobis. The tree is seldom more than 15 feet high, with a short straight stem and a spreading bushy head. The thorns are all curved. Hakis is the Dutch for hook, and consequently they do not hurt you like other thorns when you tumble into a bush, but only when you try to get out of it. My hands were cruelly torn with these thorns, and as I was still in bad condition, all the scratches festered. It was very painful. I could hardly close my hands for pain. Besides these, there were the black thorn and the white thorn. I take the names as I heard them. The first produces crisp, tasteless gum in great abundance. The other a very sweet gum that tastes and feels exactly like jujubes, but has a great tendency to ferment. We travelled on very quietly to Barman, as John Mortar was lame, and there was no hurry. We were 4 days in going there. I like gypsying work excessively, making a temporary home of a pretty spot, and then going on without regret at leaving it. A heavy thunderstorm swept by us, the first we had yet seen, and the harbinger of the rainy weather that was to provision me, as far as water was concerned, for my approaching journey. Deluges of rain and peals of thunder passed down the Swakop, such as only tropical countries can show. Yonka's answer reached me at Barmen. It was rambling and unsatisfactory, begging that I would come to his town and discuss the matters. The letter, instead of having been sent by a direct messenger, had been passed from one person to another, so that it had occupied a month in traveling from the blue hills that bounded the horizon before me. I thought this highly disrespectful, and hardly knew how to act, when 3 days later brought intelligence of a Hottentot raid of a more murderous and extensive description than any that had taken place previously. 11 whole werfts had been swept away. The Hottentots had passed within 20 miles of where I was, and fugitives came from every side telling of their misfortunes. Now this was too bad. But I determined to have patience for a little time. A traveler must learn patience, and I wrote Yonker another civil letter. I took the ground of supposing that he had not understood my last one, and I explained myself over again. My intentions were simply these: if he still intended to obstruct the way to Damara land, in spite of the carefully worded and well-indited letters that I had sent him, and which explained fairly enough what the feelings were with which the Cape government regarded marauders like himself, I would try if I could not do something personally to further my own plans of exploring as I liked. I had no idea of undertaking a piece of Kissetism in behalf of the Damaras, who are themselves a nation of thieves and cutthroats. But I was determined that Yonker's contempt of white men should not be carried so far as to jeopardize my own plans. In fact, if he did not care a straw for me, as the bearer of the wishes of our common government, I would take my own line as an individual who had a few good guns at command and would do my best to force my point. Whatever I was to do must be postponed till my men came, so I busied myself as usual with the milder occupations of latitudes and longitudes and mapping. I built a wall on the top of which I mounted my tent. A hut was made opposite for my 2 men, and the whole was well bushed in with thorns. I dined most days with Mr. Hahn, who gave me most full and accurate information about both Damaras and Hottentots. Timbu improved very much in the language, and was the life and soul of the place, while John Morta watched over my kraal like a dragon, and made the very children cry out with terror when he scowled at them. Mr. Hahn and I had numbers of the natives up to question them about the country to the north, but very little could be learnt. At last, a man came to Mr. Hahn and said there was a great lake 10 days off, of which he heard I had been in search, and that he would take me there, and the name of the lake was Omanbonde. Its direction was somewhere between north and east. This was just what I wanted, a point to aim at, something to search for and explore. It seemed so very absurd to bring a quantity of men and oxen and charge the scarcely penetrable Haki's thorns which hemmed us in on every side without something definite to go after. The name was pretty. The idea of a lake in this dusty, sun-dried land was most refreshing, and according to my temperament, I became immediately sanguine and determined to visit it. A nation called the Ovampo were said to live in that direction, a very interesting agricultural people who, according to Damara ideas, were most highly civilized. I wished much to go to them. They were the only people worth visiting that I could hear of, but I could find out very little regarding them. These savages were as ignorant of the country 2 days' journey off as an English laborer usually is. My friend, who told me of Omanbonde, told me also that I could get to the Ovampo by way of that lake, and he told me much more. He mentioned most particularly a remarkable nation, who were deficient in joints both at the elbow and knees. They were therefore unable to lift anything to their mouths by themselves. But when they dined, they did so in pairs, each man feeding his vis-a-vis. We had, after a long drought, a most terrific thunderstorm. The lightning flashed so continuously that I could read a newspaper by its light without stopping, my eye taking in enough words by one flash to enable me to read steadily on until the next one. It lightened in 3 different parts, and we were in the middle. There were some flowers in front of me, and the lightning was so vivid and its light so pure that I could not only see the flowers, but also their colors. I believe this is a very rare thing with lightning. There were 4 savages running in a line, about 100 yards off, on their way to their huts. After one of the flashes, only 3 remained. The other was struck dead. Mr. Hahn and I picked him up. It is curious how little a Negro's features are changed by death. There is no paleness. His widow howled all night, and was engaged to be married again the succeeding day. The Swakop ran violently after this storm, pouring vast volumes of turbid and broken water for 3 days down what had hitherto been an arid, sandy channel. Mr. Hahn's household was large. There was an interpreter and a sub-interpreter and again others, but all most excellently well behaved and showing to great advantage the influence of their master. These servants were chiefly Hottentots who had migrated with Mr. Hahn from Hottentot land, and like him had picked up the language of the Damaras. The sub-interpreter was married to a charming person, not only a Hottentot in figure, but in that respect a Venus among Hottentots. I was perfectly aghast at her development, and made inquiries upon that delicate point as far as I dared among my missionary friends. The result is that I believe Mrs. Petrus to be the lady who ranks second among all the Hottentots for the beautiful outline that her back affords, Jonker's wife ranking as the first. The latter, however, was slightly passé, while Mrs. Petrus was in full embonpoint. I professed to be a scientific man, and was exceedingly anxious to obtain accurate measurements of her shape, but there was a difficulty in doing this. I did not know a word of Hottentot, and could never therefore have explained to the lady what the object of my foot rule could be, and I really dared not ask my worthy missionary host to interpret for me. I therefore felt in a dilemma as I gazed at her form, that gift of bounteous nature to this favoured race, which no mantua maker with all her crinoline and stuffing can do otherwise than humbly imitate. The object of my admiration stood under a tree, and was turning herself about to all points of the compass, as ladies who wish to be admired usually do. Of a sudden my eye fell upon my sextant. The bright thought struck me, and I took a series of observations upon her figure in every direction, up and down, crossways, diagonally, and so forth, and I registered them carefully upon an outline drawing for fear of any mistake. This being done, I boldly pulled out my measuring tape, and measured the distance from where I was to the place she stood, and having thus obtained both base and angles, I worked out the results by trigonometry and logarithms. Mr. Hahn gave me a very interesting account of the first establishment of the Damara mission. He was permitted to leave Yonker's place after much trouble, and encamped amongst the Negroes in company with Mr. Rath and Mr. Bam. None of them knew a word of the language. No European had ever as yet learnt it, and the natives laughed at them and annoyed them most excessively. They were mobbed and could do scarcely anything. At last a lazy fellow, with his nose half bitten off by a hyena, attached himself to them. He happened, besides being lazy, to be also a particularly intelligent man, and soon understood what the missionaries were driving at, when they endeavoured to get at the pronouns and tenses of this tongue of prefixes. He was of the greatest use to them, and mainly through his aid, they have, after 5 or 6 years' labour, fully acquired the language. Their grammar and dictionary were to have been sent in 1852 to the professor of philology at Bonn, and have probably been received by this time. This man's nose was seized by a hyena while he was asleep on his back, very unpleasant, and an excellent story to frighten children with. I could hardly believe it until a case occurred, quite apropos. An old bushwoman who encamped under the lee of a few sticks and reeds that she had bent together, after the custom of those people, was sleeping coiled up close round the fire, with her lank feet straggling out in the dark, when a hyena, who was prowling about in the early morning, laid hold of her heel and pulled her bodily half out of the hut. Her howls alarmed the hyena, who quitted his hold, and she hobbled up the next morning to us for plasters and bandages. The very next night the old lady slept in the same fashion as before, and the hyena came in the same way, and tugged at her heel just as he had done the previous evening. The poor creature was in a sad state, and I and one of Mr. Hahn's men sat up the next night to watch for the animal. I squatted in the shade of her house. My companion covered a side path, and the woman occupied her hut as a bait. It was a grand idea, that of baiting with an old woman. The hyena came along the side path, and there received his quietus. All along the country about us was in the utmost confusion, but we were not annoyed at barmen. Once indeed men came with the news that a body of Damaras had been seen prowling behind the rocks that form a broken background to the station. And we got everything ready for an attack and watched through the night. But nothing came. The fugitives from a lately dispersed werft were staying at Barman. Their cattle had been scattered all about the country, and 3 men went out on a 3 or 4 days' excursion to look after them. When they returned, they came to the station yelling and leaping, and the whole population turned out and joined them in their war dance. I never witnessed a more demoniacal display. Their outrageous movements, their barking cries, the brandishing of the assegais, and the savage exultation of man, woman, and child at the thoughts of bloodshed formed a most horrible scene. We heard that the meaning of it all was that the Damaras, who were looking after their lost cattle, had found 2 of the robbers in the act of driving some of their herd a few miles from this place, and that they had caught the men and killed them. The story seemed improbable on very many accounts, and as the scene of the slaughter was no great distance off, the interpreter and 2 or 3 men were sent on the spoor to find out what they could. They returned with the tale that in the middle of a riverbed they had come to a place where the sand was much trodden down, and some blood was dashed about, and from that spot footsteps led in 2 directions, and with each set of footsteps there was the mark of something being dragged. The first spoor led to a bush on one side of the river where a man lay dead, the other to a thick hakis thorn cover, but nothing could be seen under it, though the sand was disturbed. Looking further, they found a spoor that went thence by itself right up the riverbed. The interpreter followed it. It was that of a person crawling and dragging himself, and the wretched man whose track it was found a mile off under a tree in a most pitiable state, with the back of his neck cut through to the bone. It was in the forenoon of the day before that he had been wounded, and it was now past the early morning, but he was still able to speak. He said, and further inquiries corroborated the story, that he and the man that lay dead were loitering about digging roots, when they saw a fire and the 3 Damaras from Barman eating meat over it. An ox lay slaughtered by their side. They offered to feed them if they would help to carry as much meat to Barman as they could, so they agreed and went on. Arriving at the riverbed, the 3 men fell upon their 2 porters, knocked them down with their knob-kerries, and struck them till they were nearly insensible, and then hacked at their necks with their assegais. This one was left for dead, but he recovered, and succeeded in crawling from under the thorn bush to where he was found. The tenacity of life in a Negro is wonderful. The object of the murder proved to be simply this. The 3 Damaras had found cattle belonging to their werft, but not to themselves. They were hungry and killed an ox to have a good gorge, and then, not knowing how to get out of the scrape of having killed their friends' cattle, they determined to lay the guilt upon these 2 unhappy men and therefore murdered them. It would never do to leave this man to die where he was, so I went with water, a litter and some bandages. The first man's throat was cut quite through, and he had long been dead. The second man I found under the shadow of a tree with his head between his 2 hands on his knees and insensible, but we roused him up. His lips were cracked with thirst, and he could not speak. I could never have believed that a man with a wound like this could have survived an hour. All the back sinews of his neck were severed to the bone, and the cut went quite round his neck, but only skin deep near the jugular vein and windpipe. The head was perfectly loose upon his shoulders and heavily bruised, and his skin was torn with the hakis thorns. I put him on the litter, but his head rolled so shockingly from side to side as the litter moved that I was obliged to make 2 cushions of grass, one on each side of his head, to steady it. At Barman he was not able to give any further account, as he became delirious and died in a few hours. I had sent messages to the different chiefs, trying to explain what the instructions were that I had received at Cape Town. The way of authenticating messages in this part of the world is curious. It is by giving some token to the messenger which he shows as a guarantee that he really comes from the person he professes to represent, just as our ancestors who were not clever at writing sent their signet rings. I could not tell what to send. It ought to be something very characteristic and not worth stealing, an article that neither grease, rain, nor dirt could spoil, and impossible to be broken. All my things were reviewed, but none were suitable except a great French cuirassier's sword in a steel scabbard, one that I had bought years before in Egypt. This was just the thing. The Damaras adore iron as we adore gold, and the brightness of the weapon was charming in their eyes. They had no idea of its use, as swords are unknown to them, but they considered it as a large knife. I therefore girded my messenger with it in the presence of his companion, and Mr. Hahn translated for me a short message to this effect: that I came from a great chief and a large nation who did not rob as the Namaquas did, but wished to be friends and not enemies with the Damaras, and to send traders into their country, that our land was very fertile, and we did not want any other, but we wanted cattle, and our traders would bring iron and buy them, that the Damaras must not think when our people come that they are spies, for they are friends, and they must treat them kindly. The messengers then repeated what they had heard, to show that they recollected it, and were given a sheep to cut up and carry for their provision, and started off. I received civil answers on the messenger's return, but the Damaras are all so hostile to each other, tribe against tribe, that I found it impossible to bring the chiefs together. Still, I was glad that I had sent my messages, as it was a demonstration, and that might be of some immediate good to me. Chapter 4. In the last week of November, I received the welcome news of Anderson's arrival at Otjimbingwe with the wagons. The oxen had taken them up in 5 long stages from Shepmansdorf, working by night and resting 36 hours between each pull. It was impossible for me to leave Barman, as matters were now pending between me and the native chiefs, and I daily expected to hear some news of Yonka's movements. On December 4th, Anderson rode over to me, and his and Hans's performances with the unbroken oxen and 2 heavy wagons were loudly praised by everybody. All had gone well. Anderson had shot his first rhinoceros, my men had worked fairly, all except one wagon driver, who besides laziness and insolence had been caught in the act of stealing to a great extent. He was a man I had determined to get rid of some time before, and I now only waited until I could engage somebody to take his place before I did so. Nothing in particular transpired. I failed in learning more about Oman Bonde and returned to Otjimbingwe. I went a few days before Anderson, as I wished to visit Erongo with Hans before starting with the wagons. I left the mules at Barman and rode back on ride oxen which Anderson had brought for me. The mules were troublesome creatures, requiring too much watching. They constantly tried to run away, and when off, their pace was so good that the men had runs of many hours before they could overtake and bring them back. They gave me great anxiety at first, but now I was quite tired of their tricks and hardly cared what became of them. I arrived at Otjimbingwe about the 10th of December and found the wagons drawn up on the cliff under a thick roofing of reeds, and with reeds stacked all round them. Everything looked most perfectly in order, and I felt delighted with Hans's management. My wagon gear had required much putting in order. The trek tows or ropes to which the yokes were fastened were quite rotten. They were remarkably good pieces of rope when I bought them in Cape Town, so much so as to attract the critical eye of the sailors. But nothing of hemp or cotton stands this climate. I do not know why, but string, yarn, shirts, and thread all become useless after a short exposure to the air. Hans had therefore saved the hide of every ox that had been slaughtered, and had either dressed it to make raims and such like things, or else twisted it up raw to make into a trek tow. We still wanted one hide, which a Guy knew was kind enough to afford us. Hans wounded him after a long stalk, but though the animal got off for the time, he was steadily followed by Hans and John Allen for hours till nightfall. They then slept on the track and took it up again the next morning. In a couple of hours they found the beast on 3 legs, at bay, under a stone, where he was shot and flayed. Gnu is literally the only hide, besides that of oxen and kudus, that is fit for a trek tow. Almost all other animals have either too small and too thin skins, or else the opposite extreme, while gemsbok and zebra hides, which are of the right thickness, are the worst of leather. I stopped a day at Otjimbingwe, and then rode off with Hans, John St. Helena, and Gabriel to the mountain Erongo. It was partly an excursion to buy oxen and sheep for my journey, and partly to see the country. and that remarkable stronghold of the Gu Damup. The drought was so great, no constant rain having fallen, that troops of Damaras were flocking in from all sides to the comparatively abundant water of the mission station. One of the captains, who was in advance of the rest of his people, offered to go back with me as guide. He said he would take us to different werfts on our road, where we might barter as much as we liked, but that he dare not take us to Erongo, as his people and the Gu Damup who lived there were always fighting together. I took a few articles of exchange, some of each of the different things that I had, and we all started in the afternoon. Our native followers included two Gu Damups, who were to introduce us to their relatives on Erongo, in the same way as the captain was to recommend us to his friends on the road. We emerged from the broad valley of the Swakop after 3 hours traveling, then scrambled along a very stony road, off-packed for a couple of hours in a watercourse, and travelled on till daybreak, when we came to the first Damara village where, after a good deal of explanation and long waiting, we were tolerated and allowed some milk. Hans was my only interpreter. A little bartering took place here and some sheep were bought. We then rode on down a broad grassy plain, bounded on the left by high mountains, and some more bartering took place at midday, our oxen on each occasion being put under the charge of the captain of the tribe, who had them watered and sent out to grass. I felt nervous at being amongst such numbers of armed, ill-looking scoundrels as these Damaras are. Their features are usually placid, but the least excitement brings out all the lines of a savage passion. They always crowded round us and hemmed us in, and then tried to hustle us away from our bags and baggage. They have an impudent way of handling and laying hold of everything they covet, and of begging in an authoritative tone, laughing among themselves all the time. It is very difficult to keep them off. The least show of temper would be very hazardous among such a set of people, and it is hardly possible to amuse and keep them in order without a ready command of their language. I must say that these savages are magnificent models for sculptors, for they are tall, cleanly made, and perfectly upright. Their head is thrown well back, and their luxuriant but woolly hair is clustered round an open forehead. Their features are often beautifully chiseled, though the expression in them is always coarse and disagreeable. Their whole body shines with grease and red paint, if they can afford those luxuries. And though they are the dirtiest and most vermin-covered of savages, yet the richer class among them are well polished up, and present an appearance which at a short distance is very imposing and statuesque. They call clothes by the same name that they give to the scum of stagnant water. And I must say that in personal appearance these naked savages were far less ignoble objects than we Europeans in our dirty shirts and trousers. We arrived at our guide's werft in the afternoon, and I was thoroughly fatigued from heat and want of sleep and a pretty long ride, but Hans kept watch and bartered perpetually. I could find no shade, there scarcely ever is shade in Damara land, but dropped asleep for 2 or 3 hours in the full sun, which made me sick and poorly. Gabriel had recovered a little of the spirits that he had lost by travelling, and was now becoming impudent to the Damaras. He had a quick, angry temper when annoyed, having already tried to stab 2 of his fellow servants, and now that the Damaras were thronging round us and teasing us a great deal, I was in much alarm lest some imprudence of the lads should give them a pretext for an attack. If fighting had once commenced, we should have been as full of assegais as St. Sebastian ever was of arrows, and our guns would have availed but little. Just at this time, as we were all squatting in a ring, except Hans and John St. Helena, who were a little to one side and out of the way, some hungry native dogs paid our saddlebags a visit and gnawed at the leather. Gabriel took a rhinoceros hide whip to frighten them off, and one snarled, but retreated to his master through the middle of the ring. Gabriel rushed, quite daft, after the dog, and gave a tremendous slash with the long, supple whip at him, but he quite overreached his aim, and the chief got the benefit of the cut full on his legs. Another instant, and Gabriel was prostrate, while the chief, like a wild beast, glared over him. The muscle of every Damara was on the stretch. Every man had his assegai. My gun lay by my side, but I had sense enough not to clutch at it. I tried with all my power to look as steady and unconcerned as I could. and I must partly thank the sun which had baked my face into a set expression for success. It was a fearfully anxious time to me, though it lasted but for a moment. Gradually the savage's grasp relaxed, the Damaras around fell back into nonchalant attitudes, and at length the ferocious expression of the chief's face somewhat smoothed down, and he rose and allowed the disconcerted Gabriel to sneak off, but kept the whip as a trophy, and possibly as a memento of wrongs received. When we were about to start, I made myself as civil as I could, and then gently took hold of the whip, and he allowed me to coax it out of his hand, so all ended well. We had bought 4 or 5 oxen and a few sheep, which we intended to drive with us to Erongo, the broad table mountain that now lay 8 hours in front of us and bounded the horizon. It was 5 hours' travel to the next water, but it took us much longer, for we had some hunting by the way. The heat became fearful, and fever was upon me. I could hardly sit the journey out, and was extremely glad to get to the bed of the Canna River, a tributary of the Swakop, where an hour's crowing and digging gave enough water for the oxen. After a good meal, as the evening was clear, we were again in the saddle and pushed on for the mountains, the length of whose escarpment from east to west was 15 miles. Its height by rough sextant measurement was 2,800 feet. In one part of it there was a break, the mountains rising like parapets on either hand, and to this break we steered. It was pitch dark when we got there, and glad I was to lay my throbbing head to rest. In the morning I dispatched the 2 Damups up the hill to tell the inhabitants of our arrival and to request guides from them. I spent the morning in sleeping under huge overhanging slabs of limestone, enjoying to the full the shadow of a broad rock in a thirsty land. In the afternoon we rambled about trying to climb the hill and to obtain a good view of the adjacent country. The rocks that composed Erongo were here in huge, smooth white masses, often hundreds of feet without a fissure. The hill seemed built by some cyclopean architect. Immense round boulders of the same stones were strewed here and there at its base. Our Gudamup returned in the evening with a promise that guides should be sent us early the next day. We put our articles of exchange into small packs, as men had to carry them up the steep mountain by the foot road. When cattle are sent up, they are driven round to a different and more distant entrance which we did not care to visit. It is just practicable for oxen and no more. Traveller with Pack Oxen, drawn on stone by W. L. Walton, printed by Hullmandel and Walton. We had a grand chase after some zebras in the early morn. A large herd had ventured into the recess in which we were encamped during the night, and as they returned, smelt our fire and headed back. We heard them, and everybody ran to cut them off, some with guns and some without. The zebras made a round and galloped through a narrow gorge within arm's length of those who were there. We could not carry our sleeping things up the mountain as they were too heavy, but I took a small plaid. I was very unwell, but tried to battle off my fever. John St. Helena, Gabriel, and the Damaras were left to watch the cattle below, while Hans and I and the Damup climbed for 2 hours over smooth slabs, most of the time without shoes for fear of slipping. The slabs over which the only path lay were disjointed from the main rock, and enormous fissures lay between them and it. When we travelled along the side that sloped towards these fissures, it was to me very nervous work, for my feet would not grasp the rock, and if I had tumbled, I should have explored much more of the mountain than I desired. The measurement of these slabs is not in feet, but in hundreds of feet. Once on the top, the air was deliciously cool, and the boulders strewn about gave shade to sit under when we pleased. Leopards are very numerous here. They have nothing wild to feed on except baboons and steinbocks. However, the Damup have plenty of sheep and goats, and these the leopards attack. The summit of Erongo is a succession of ravines clothed with thorn coppice and a great deal of cactus. The effect is pretty, and I should much like to live there for summer quarters. Along the ravines, a few wild fig trees grow. After a couple of hours of up and down walking, in which we started a magnificent leopard, we arrived at the chief's werft, and I liked its situation and effect very much. It was not in the open flat, like those of the Damaras, who fear the neighborhood of any cover which might conceal an advancing enemy, but among trees. It was also built more durably. The Damara huts have but one room. They are like those I described at Walfish Bay. These were rather complicated. The framework of the hut was generally made by growing trees, a clump of which was selected and their lower branches thinned. Then the tops were bent down and pleached together, the trees in the middle dividing the huts into 2 or even 3 rooms. The shape on the outside was like a snail shell. The entrance faced to the leeward. Going into the chief's hut, the entrance led straight into the main apartment, on either side of which were rooms, one of them for the chief's wife. There were plenty of utensils about, such as wooden milk bowls, pipes, and so on. There was a stuffed ottoman, and the whole place had a great appearance of comfort. The chief was a gentleman and very courteous. Though Hottentot was his language, yet he spoke a little Damara, in which language we talked to him. He had a charming daughter, the greatest belle among the blacks that I had ever seen, and a most thorough-paced coquette. Her main piece of finery, and one that she flirted about in a most captivating manner, was a shell of the size of a penny piece. She had fastened it to the end of a lock of front hair, which was of such a length as to permit the shell to dangle to the precise level of her eyes. She had learnt to move her head with so great precision as to throw the shell exactly over whichever eye she pleased, and the lady's winning grace consisted in this feat of bo-peep, first eclipsing one eye and languishing out of the other, and then with an elegant toss of the head reversing the proceedings. Her papa would sell me no oxen nor sheep. He insisted that he had none, though the place was full of tracks. But these people are very cunning to strangers, lest the stranger should think proper to steal their cattle. I very much regretted that I had not a good interpreter, as I had taken a fancy to the chief, and should have liked to have had a long conversation with him. He was not paramount over the mountain, but there were 1 or 2 more captains. Indeed, he assured me he could not give me guides over the hill, as his men dare not travel about it. I was obliged to return, for I had my time limited in many ways, else I should have liked to have fully explored the place. The fever that was on me increased hourly, and I was anxious to return. The night was bitterly cold, but I curled myself in my thin plaid round the fire, and got through the long hours somehow or other. The chief and I interchanged presents. We bought a few goats, and returned as we came. The rocky slabs looked more dangerous and slippery than ever, but no accident occurred. The next evening we slept at the werft, where Gabriel had distinguished himself. I felt wandering, and was delirious during most of the night, but could sit on oxback well enough the next day. It was Christmas Day, but I dared not stop to do it honor. We rode on 5 hours. Hans shot 4 zebras. The Damaras gave us milk in exchange for their meat, and that was our dinner. The next night I was again ill, but less so than before, and the ensuing day I rode through to Ochimbingwe. The distance between it and Erongo is about 20 hours' travel. The result of my journey was that I bought 25 oxen and 30 or 40 sheep. 4 common guns had been bartered for 20 oxen, which was a material addition to my stock. Anderson, who had had a slight fever like myself, was there in full vigor. He had been in an almost hand-to-hand combat with a lion, for the beast was on one side of a small bush, growling at him whilst he was on the other. He shot the lion. A stirring night scene had occurred here, which Anderson witnessed. As the evening closed in, some people saw a lion kill a giraffe on the opposite side of the river. The alarm was given, everybody took firebrands, and it was quite dark when the mob arrived at the place. They ran unconcernedly up to the giraffe and frightened the lion off it, who kept roaring and prowling about them close by whilst they cut up the meat. I determined to leave my cart at Ochimbingwe, as I had hardly mules enough to take it. Neither could I spare Timbu to drive it. It was thatched over against the side of the mission house, and Mr. Rath kindly took charge of the mule's harness. 2 days after my return from Erongo, my first experience in wagon traveling began. I hated it from the first, and never became reconciled to it. I disliked its slowness and the want of independence about it. In a rugged and wooded country, long detours have to be made to avoid obstacles which ride and pack oxen go across without difficulty. Roads have to be explored, bushes cut down, and the great stones rolled out of the way. The wagon is a crushing, cumbrous affair, and according to my ideas, totally unfitted for the use of an explorer, except in moderately level countries. I was never happier than when I left it behind, and took to the saddle. The oxen were excessively wild and seemed to have quite forgotten what they had learned. It took us from an hour and a half to 2 hours to inspan the two wagons. Notwithstanding we had so great a force of men, most of whom were acknowledged to be thoroughly acquainted with the management of oxen. We had a succession of mishaps the whole way to Barman. It took us 7 days to go the 70 miles, and my men had no light work of it. The rainy season was daily expected, and when it comes, violent torrents constantly sweep down the Swakop. This was unpleasant, as its bed had to be crossed perpetually, and it was invariably in the midst of its deep sand that the oxen came to a halt and resolutely refused more work for that day. On one occasion, the sticking point was a steep sand pitch of about 6 feet high out of the riverbed. The oxen drew the wagon till its four wheels reached the top of the pitch, and there it stuck. We tried everything, but the pull was entirely beyond their power. Indeed, they were far too wild to exert themselves together. It really seemed as though we should remain fixed there till the oxen had been thoroughly broken in by other means, or till the river swept us away. However, I recollected the manner in which our ancestors in the times of the Druids are said to have managed their large stones, and tried that plan on my wagon. That is to say, I lifted one wheel with the lifter, and had a flat stone put under it, then the other, and did the same to that. And so I continued raising the hind wheels alternately, until the back end of the wagon was lifted up some 3 feet on 2 piles of stones. I had, of course, to be careful in making my buildings very firm, and in scotching the forewheels, lest the wagon should run back. I now built a causeway from the piles up to the forewheels, and lastly, put smooth stones not only under these, but also for a few paces in advance of them. That completed the task, which only required 2 hours to execute, for there were plenty of flat stones about, and I had 10 or 12 men to carry them. I then inspanned a team, who trotted away with the wagon quite easily along my pavement. The water was all crow water, and my herd of oxen and sheep were all watered by hand. The way we set about choosing our place for encampment and making it was this. As the wagon still moved on, we kept a lookout along the river bed, till some indications were seen of water, such as holes or small wells dug by Damaras, who had been camping about. If the yield of water appeared sufficient, and if there was any show of grass near, the wagons were outspanned. The place chosen was by a tree or at the side of some bush, where the requisites of a smooth ground to sleep upon, shelter from the wind, abundant thorn bushes to make a sheep's kraal of, and neighboring firewood were best combined. The Damaras were then sent with axes to cut thorn bushes for the kraal. The white men went with spades to dig a couple of wells out, and make them broad and deep, and the cattle watchers were off with the oxen and sheep to grass, 2 men to each flock or herd. They often fed a couple of miles away from us. Any idle hand fetched enough firewood to start 2 cooking fires, on one of which the iron pots for the dinners of myself, Anderson, Hans, and John Mortar were placed, on the other those of the wagon men. The Damaras had an iron pot between them, but they never had food given them till late, or else they stopped working in order to eat it at once. Usually we had to slaughter something. The wagon driver and the men's cook generally killed the sheep. If an ox was wanted, I shot him. Thus a great many different things were going on at the same time. The men were digging wells, slaughtering and cutting up, cooking at 2 fires. The Damaras were watching cattle, cutting thorn bushes and carrying firewood. When the wells were deepened sufficiently, a hollow trough was scooped out in the sand and a piece of canvas laid on it. The oxen were then sent for, and while Damaras stood in the well with a wooden bamboos, a sort of bucket, ladling out water into the canvas, the oxen were driven up by 3s to drink. But unless the ground is very porous, the canvas sheet is hardly necessary. In this way one gives drink at the rate of about an ox a minute at each well, and sheep drink very fast indeed. It seldom required an hour to water my herd after the wells were once cleared out. The thorn branches for the kraal are laid round a circle, each alongside the other in the direction of radii. The cut ends are inwards, and the broad bushy heads, not the sides of the branch, make the outer circumference. Sheep and goats pack into so small a space that their kraal has never to be more than 20 feet diameter, but they must have one, or else every kind of accident would occur, for they are by no means so domestic as oxen and very stupid. If it were not for a kraal, the hyenas, who serenade us every night, would be sure to do constant mischief and scatter the flock over the country. Oxen, unless thirsty or hungry or cold or in a restless, homesick state of mind, never leave the wagons, but lie in a group round the fire, chewing the cud with their large eyes glaring in the light and apparently thinking. We made no kraal for them. To continue, as the evening closes in, the sheep are driven into their kraal, the door is bushed up, the Damaras get their meat and make their own sleeping places, and we get our dinner. Then I make a few observations with my sextant, which occupies an hour or so, and everybody else has some mending or some other employment. Timbu gets out my rug and sleeping things. The firewood is brought close to the fire, and we lie down in two large groups, Anderson, Hans, John Mortar, and myself, round one fire, and the wagon men and Damaras round the other, and all gradually drop off to sleep, the Damaras invariably being the last awake. It is a great mistake to suppose that early to bed and early to rise is the rule among savages. All those that I have seen, whether in the north or south, eat and talk till a very late hour. I grant that they get up early, but then they sleep half the day. When we outspanned a few hours from Barman, I rode on in the evening, very anxious to learn if anything new had been heard from Yonka. It was all very unfavorable. No actual attack had taken place, but the Damaras were scattered, and bands of them were prowling about their country. Not one of my Damaras would go on with me. A guide that I had picked up at Otjimbingwe refused to proceed. There was a growing fear among my own men, and Yonka's previous personal threats to me, such as they were corroborated. I therefore determined to make some sort of demonstration which would bring him into better order. And in doing this, I was confirmed by a rather humble request which I had received from him when I was at Barman, that I would visit him at his place, from which I gathered either that he intended to play some tricks upon me there, or else that he felt he had gone too far and was penitent. In either case, my presence would bring matters to a crisis and get rid of that uncertainty and delay which would breed discouragement among my men and be fatal to my scheme of travel. I wished to force some open admission from the man that his late conduct towards the missionaries and the Damaras had been infamous, and to do it in such a way that the Damaras should hear about it and understand that I was in no mood either to abet or to obey the Hottentots. Barman was a bad place for me to encamp at, as grass was extremely scarce, so I moved on to Schmelin's Hope, which was the Ultima Thule of discovery in Damara land. There a strong ox kraal was made, and the deserted and half-pulled-down house put in order, and leaving Anderson in charge, I took Hans, John Morta, and one of the wagon men, who spoke very good Dutch, and started for Yonka. I previously gave it out among the Damaras that I was gone to make peace between the Hottentots and them. I packed up my red hunting coat, jackboots, and cords, and rode in my hunting cap. It was a costume unknown in these parts, and would, I expected, aid in producing the effect I desired. I started on the 16th of December. It was about a 3 days' ride, but as none of us knew the road, we strayed a little, which made us longer. I saw a horrible sight on the way, which has often haunted me since. We had taken a short cut, and were a day and a half from our wagons, when I observed some smoke in front, and rode to see what it was. An immense blackthorn tree was smouldering, and from the quantity of ashes about, there was all the appearance of its having burnt for a long time. By it were tracks that we could make nothing of, no footmarks, only an impression of a hand here and there. We followed them, and found a wretched woman, most horribly emaciated. Both her feet were burnt quite off, and the wounds were open and unhealed. Her account was that many days back she and others were encamping there, and when she was asleep, a dry but standing tree, which they had set fire to, fell down and entangled her among its branches. There she was burnt before she could extricate herself, and her people left her. She had since lived on gum alone, of which there was vast quantities about. It oozes down from the trees, and forms large cakes in the sand. There was water close by, for she was on the edge of a riverbed. I did not know what to do with her. I had no means of conveying her anywhere, or any place to convey her to. The Damaras kill useless and worn-out people. Even sons smother their sick fathers, and death was evidently not far from her. I had 3 sheep with me, so I off-packed and killed one. She seemed ravenous, and though I purposely had off-packed some 200 yards from her, yet the poor wretch kept crawling and dragging herself up to me, and would not be withheld, for fear I should forget to give her the food I promised. When it was ready and she had devoured what I gave her, the meat acted, as it often does in such cases, and fairly intoxicated her. She attempted to stand regardless of the pain and sang and tossed her lean arms about. It was perfectly sickening to witness the spectacle. I did the only thing I could. I cut the rest of the meat in strips and hung it within her reach, and where the sun would jerk, i.e., dry and preserve it. It was many days' provision for her. I saw she had water, firewood, and gum in abundance, and then I left her to her fate. We had a little shooting on our way, and I also had an opportunity of climbing a high hill, which is a very conspicuous landmark, whence I had a wonderfully fine view both of the country I had visited, and also a glimpse of that which I hoped soon to explore. We scrambled over some very rugged and thorny ground for 5 hours, having quite lost our way, but making a cast, came down on the wagon road at a place which was recognized by Hans as being 3 or 4 hours from Icum's Yonkers village. It was an immense kraal, formed by a strong stockade, in which Katimasha, a Damara chief, entrenched himself once when he and Yonker were allies, and robbed the other Damaras in company. Some years back they had dissolved partnership, and Katimasha, not feeling safe, absconded with all his men to Damara land, of which he is now one of the principal chiefs. Here I made my toilet and refreshed my trusty ox, and in the cool of the evening rode down upon Icum's. Hans knew the place, though not the road we had travelled to it, and pointed out a hill, round the corner of which the village lay. Even Ceylon, my ox, caught the excitement, and snuffed the air like a war horse. We formed together, gained the corner of the hill. Hans recognized Yonker's hut, and we, I cannot say dashed, but jogged right at it. An obstacle occurred, and happily was surmounted, which might have much disconcerted the assault. It was a ditch, or little ravine, that a torrent had made. It was rather deep and 4 feet wide. But I was in hunting costume, and I am sure Ceylon knew it, for he shook his head and took it uncommonly well. In fact, oxen, if you give them time, are not at all bad leapers. The others followed in style. So far was well. The huts of the place were all in front, and Yonkers much the largest. Everybody saw us and was looking at us. There is great etiquette in these parts about coming to a strange place, but we defied all that, and I rode and rode until my ox's head not only faced, but actually filled the door of the astonished chief. Conceive the effect. My Dutch was far from fluent, so I rated him in English and after a while condescended to use an interpreter. He never dared look me in the face as I glared down upon him from my ox. I then rode away in a huff and took up my quarters in the village, and received in great state the humble messages which he sent me. Now, all this may seem laughable, but earlams are like children, and the manner which wins respect from them is not that which has most influence with us. To go a step higher, to the burly, broad-limbed Dutch colonists. I must relate a rather amusing instance of the views some acquaintances of mine among them entertained of the physique of those high officials in England, whose enactments wielded their destiny. It was after the anti-convict agitation, and the friends I allude to expressed the utmost surprise and even disbelief at hearing that the then colonial minister was not a person of 6-foot stature, else how could he have dared to oppose their wishes? I inquired further and found that report commonly painted his lordship as a kind of ogre or violent giant. I desired Yonker to come to me with his chief people, and I lectured them soundly. We had 3 or 4 interviews. I spoke in English and was interpreted both into Dutch and Hottentot. I saw clearly that I had made a favorable impression upon them. I insisted upon a full and ample apology being written to Mr. Kolber, and an assurance given of future forbearance and justice being shown towards the Damaras. Yonker begged that Cornelius, the chief of the Red people, should be called to his place, and such other people of importance in these parts as could be brought together, and he also mentioned his willingness to enter into any feasible plan for the establishment of better order in the country. The four chiefs hereabouts are Yonker and Amaral, who are Earlhams, Swartboy and Cornelius, who are pure Hottentots. Messengers were at once dispatched to Cornelius and Amaral, and I, wishing to see Rehoboth, rode over there and undertook to bring back Swartboy. His tribe is a large but not a strong one. A long time ago he was as bad as any of the rest, if not worse. But Sir James Alexander, when he came into the country, frightened him into order, and since that time missionaries have settled in his place and obtained considerable influence over him. Swartboy's present position was merely a passive one, but his character carried much weight with it, and I desired to make him a party to what Yonker and Cornelius should arrange together. I wished also to make him friendly to myself. The other chief, Amiral, an Earlham, was far off. He had always treated the whites particularly well, but his son and heir and part of his tribe were said to have been robbing the Damaras of late. Neither Yonker nor any other Hottentot has supreme power in his tribe, for these people are most tenacious republicans and insist upon a council of elders finally ratifying everything that is proposed. But Yonker is by far the most influential man in the whole country and has his own way in everything. I believe that on great emergencies he dispenses with the deliberations of the council. I had a long conversation with Yonker upon those parts of Damara land which he had seen. He had made 2 long excursions with a large body of men on each occasion, one by Irongo to somewhere near Cape Cross, the other in which he tried to reach the Ovampo, but was unable to proceed further than Omanbonde on account of the exhausted state of his oxen. He and his men had brought back all kinds of wonderful and impossible reports about the Lake Omanbonde. But the information which he gave me himself was, so far as it went, perfectly accurate. He spoke much of the native bushmen that he found there, and who went freely among the Ovampo. This surprised me much, as I had no idea that the Hottentot race existed so far to the north. Yonker was perfectly familiar by a report with the river that formed the further boundary of the Ovampo. A very intelligent Englishman, a blacksmith, who lived at Rehoboth, was returning there at the time I proposed starting from Yonker's, and I travelled in his wagon. A great part of the distance we went through broad plains bordered by high and distant hills and full of grass, but hardly any water. The last stage from water to water was 11 hours' travel, with a little pool from a previous storm in the middle, but this failed on our return. Rehoboth is situated on a bare white limestone rock, with a hot spring of mineral water gushing out. A situation anything but pleasant. Yet the village is very orderly and neat. I heard the full particulars of a late judgment and punishment by Umap, an independent chief of a very small tribe, though he had at least an equal claim with Cornelius to the chiefdom of the Red people. Umap's son became ill and wasted away. The guilt was fastened on some neighboring bushmen, who were accused of charming away his life. Umap, therefore, had a pit dug about 5 feet across and 7 or 8 deep, and he made a bonfire in it. Then he took the 8 bushmen and women on whom his suspicion had fallen and put them down alive into this pit, covered them over with hot earth, and made a second fire above their grave. The incident occurred before I landed at Wolfish Bay, but I had not had the story corroborated till now. Umap is not considered otherwise than as a very respectable Hottentot, but he is classed as one of the old school. I met Swartboy travelling in his wagon, and we had a couple of hours' conversation in which I was very favourably impressed with him. He was a reasonable, good-hearted, but rather timid old man. He promised to use his influence as far as he could towards furthering any arrangements which would lead to peace in the country, and said he would meet the other captains at Icom's at the time appointed. I was excessively annoyed to hear of the doings of the man I had discarded as being a confirmed bad character. He had been making an improper use of my name, declaring that I had sent him on some special message, and that unless he was well fed and taken care of, I should come with a complete army of men, and so on, etc. He had frightened Swartboy's people into great civility, and then stole cattle from them and drove them off, while Swartboy's people dared not punish him. He was said to be 15 hours off, and though I had but 2 days and 3 nights to spare, I was determined to ride after and catch him if I could. I am for flogging men for stealing or attempt at murder, and this was a case that came within my code, so I borrowed oxen and was off. The night was too dark to start in, till about 1 o'clock in the morning, when I rode very fast in 3 stages to the place, which we were able to reach during the late afternoon of the next day. To my grief, the fellow had trekked southwards in the morning, and was now many hours further, and had also stated his intention of travelling steadily on. My oxen were knocked up, and so were we, and overtaking him now was out of the question, hungry as we were. As soon as the pot was put on the fire, we all fell fast asleep, and forgot our dinner till the midnight chill awoke us. Trotting on oxback for many hours is very severe work, if the animals, as they usually do, require much urging. The creatures had eaten and were fit to return on the forenoon of the next day, and we returned late in the night to Rehoboth. I there obtained some valuable additions to my stock of oxen. Timmerman, the one I had just ridden, I bought off-hand. He was a tame, sturdy ox. I also got 2 couple of front oxen and some hind oxen. These are the important ones of the team, and if good, the rest are easily made to do their work. I also hired a black wagon driver, Phlebas, who knew nothing of his own language, but had been a trained Hottentot and Dutch interpreter, and Swartboy very kindly gave me his henchman Onesimus, who, besides being by profession his lifeguardsman, was his interpreter to the Damaras. These 2 were most accurate renderers of whatever they were told to say, as could be easily judged from the answers of the persons addressed. Timbu interpreted loosely from either English or Dutch into Damara, but he knew none of these languages well. He had a patois of his own. People at first find conversation by interpreters a bore, but after a little use it becomes no greater hindrance, as it is no greater delay than dictating or writing a letter. Savages, who are naturally sententious, fall very readily into the system, and here, where the Hottentots and Damaras are so often brought into contact, every chief is well accustomed to it. We were a good deal troubled for the want of water on our return. The little pool I mentioned was dried up, and we had taken no water with us, for want of a vessel to carry it in. Our Damaras, who drove the cattle, were quite knocked up under the excessive heat, and a gu damup, whose charge it was to carry the iron pot, lay down somewhere altogether exhausted. At night we arrived, and all of us drank water till we were quite ill. I continued resolving to drink no more, and then rewarded my resolution with 1 more mouthful. One cannot help drinking. The water seems to have no effect in quenching the thirst. The next day we rode but a short distance, as we had to wait for the 2 men who were missing, and they might be badly put to it. However, they never came. We thought the gu damup had stolen the pot and absconded in an old soldier's coat with which I had just rewarded his fidelity. There was considerable doubt if we should find water for the remainder of the journey, and as our stomachs had been thrown out of order, I hardly liked to go so far without taking some. I could not think what to use as a water vessel when my eye fell upon a useless cur of ours that never watched and only frightened game by running after them, and whose death I had long had in view. Dog skin is the most waterproof of hides, so I dispatched the cur and skinned him. His death was avenged upon me in a striking manner, for during the night a pack of wild dogs came upon us, scattered our sheep who were not well kraaled in, and killed them all. We traced the carcasses of some in the morning by the vultures that settled upon them. 2 goats alone remained, which I had bought at Icom's. Oddly enough, just as we were starting, the goats disappeared. We beat every bush for half an hour, but could not find them. At last we became tired of the search and continued our journey, reaching Icom's at night. To our wonder and amazement, as soon as we arrived, we met the faithful lost gu damup, not only with the iron pot on his head like a helmet as he usually wore it, and red coat on his back, but also driving the identical goats we had lost, and which were under his peculiar charge. He had found them walking along the wagon spoor. They must have run on ahead before we first lost them, and then fallen into the hands of the ghoul's damup, who had himself passed us without knowing it. He felt he had done wrong in staying behind, but he said he was very tired. He had found some roots on the way and lived on them. After his story, he brought me a whacking big stick, quite as a matter of course, that I should beat him for what he had done. The water skin I had made was not of much use, as the day was comparatively cool. Being fresh from the animal, it had to be used with the hair inside. It held the water very well, but gave a doggy taste to it. Swartboy and Cornelius were waiting for me. The latter was anything but a chief, either in manner or appearance. Nothing had been heard from Amaral. It was barely possible that any answer should have been received, owing to the distance. Besides the three chiefs present, there were a great number of the influential men. I used as interpreters Phlebas, my new wagon driver, a missionary schoolmaster, and a Greeker. These all spoke Hottentot and Dutch perfectly, and the last two a little English also. I knew enough Dutch myself to be able to check any gross mistake in the rendering from English to that language, and the three interpreters were checks upon one another in the rest. The schoolmaster spoke. The others interrupted if he was not accurate. We met together more than once. The meetings were long and very orderly, many people speaking, and all to the point. These men evidently felt they had gone much too far, and openly acknowledged that the system of robbing had done much mischief to themselves. No planting or sowing was going on, the Hottentots were idle and restless, there was no law in the country, and the Damaras harassed them with frequent retaliation. They begged me to suggest some system on which they could proceed, and also to draw up some laws which would at least meet the common cases of cattle robbing and murder. I was rather diffident of success, but in these wild parts a trained legislator is hardly to be expected to travel, and the best must be made of what materials are at hand. So, being convinced that I had already gained a favourable footing amongst them, and that what I said would be attended to, I thought the matter well over, and made my debut as a lawgiver. As every one of my new friends were robbers by profession, it would never do to make much ado about theft, for if I did, nobody would enforce the law. I therefore simply made theft fineable at double the number of oxen stolen, together with a mulct upon the people of the werft to which the criminal belonged, if, as was usually the case, they concealed him. The spoor is so certain and honest a witness, and facts become so notorious that there is little difficulty about questions of evidence. In this spirit I drew up a few laws which Cornelius and Jonker discussed, and to which they fully assented. I also endeavoured to restrain the jealousies and quarrels between the Erlams and Hottentots by inducing Cornelius and Jonker to make a mutual agreement that criminals should be punished by the captain of the country where the crime was committed, and not, as heretofore, by his own captains. The greater part of the Hottentots about me had that peculiar set of features which is so characteristic of bad characters in England, and so general among prisoners, that it is usually, I believe, known by the name of the felon face. I mean that they have prominent cheekbones, bullet-shaped head, cowering but restless eyes, and heavy sensual lips, and added to this, a shackling dress and manner. The ladies have not universally that very remarkable development which was so striking in Petrus's wife at Barmen. It is a peculiarity which disappears when one of the parents have European blood, while other points, more especially the absence of white at the root of the fingernails, remain after many crosses with the Dutch. Some few of the lads and girls have remarkably pleasing Chinese-looking faces. Jonker is decidedly a talented man, and seems in full vigour though upwards of 60 years of age. His remarks were particularly shrewd and his descriptions concise and graphic. He came out quite as a diplomatist in the long conversations I had with him, artfully trying to turn the conversation to his own ends. I could not make out that there were more than 40 horses belonging to Jonker and his men. Neither they nor any others would sell me one. They said they couldn't possibly spare them. Those I had seen were sorry, half-starved creatures, but with many good points about them. They were all from the country about the Orange River. I endeavoured to appoint a general meeting at Schmelin's Hope for the Hottentot and Damara chiefs, where I would feed them well and cement peace between them, as far as such an affair could do it. A time was fixed, about a fortnight thence, but it never came off. Everybody mistrusted his neighbors, and only Swartboy, who was my guest there for a couple weeks, was present. Kahikane sent a very friendly message, and I was quite enough satisfied with what I had done. The missionaries were highly gratified at my good fortune, and I had great pleasure in sending to Mr. Kolb the apology and the promise that I had made Yonka write to him. Matters now looked more sunshiny. There were nearly 100 oxen in my kraal and 60 or 70 sheep. My wagon driver, who had stolen and who latterly had been insolent, I paid in articles of exchange and dismissed. Gabriel, at his own wish, was left behind. A dozen Damaras agreed to go with us up the country, and Kahikane, our friend, lay in our way. Hans and I rode short exploring excursions to find a road by which we could take the wagon out of the bed of the Swakop, and found one with great difficulty. Anderson then rode a wider sweep to see whether the country away from the Swakop looked open enough for a wagon. He went over a great deal of country and returned with favorable news in 5 days, but he hardly saw a Damara. The land was so thinly peopled. We then made ready for our start, though the 5 mules had run quite a way. They were traced through Barman and Ochimbingwe to Tsobis, a distance of more than 100 miles, and there the chase was given up. I may as well anticipate my story and mention that they, or rather 3 of them, arrived at Schepmansdorf. They had crossed the Nunip Plain by instinct. The whole distance these runaways had travelled by themselves, visan that from Schmelin's Hope to Schepmansdorf is 85 hours' travel very nearly, which at the rate of 2.5 miles per hour gives 212 miles. A few incidents occurred at Schmelin's Hope. First a plague of caterpillars that covered the ground, then a swarm, but not an utterly destructive one, of locusts, and lastly a flight of migratory storks, who made great war upon the locusts. We were perpetually teased by some hyenas. They came most impudently in amongst us, as their peculiar spoors showed, the hind and 4 feet being of unequal size. But we never could catch them. At last the dogs overtook one on a bright moonlight night and held him at bay. I was asleep and was quite undressed when their sharp barks awoke me, and I had only time to put on my shoes. The dogs and hyena were on the other side of the Swakop, which here is exceedingly broad, about 300 yards, and by the time we had floundered through the sand to the other side, the animal had retreated among the rocks and hackey's thorns into the deep shade, but the dogs held well to him. I sorely regretted the leather trousers that were left behind, as my bare legs were scarred and bleeding. I could not see the hyena, except one glimpse when he brushed against my leg. At last the dogs surrounded him in a patch of moonshine 4 or 5 feet from where I was, and I put a bullet through his backbone. The chase and the scurry made as exciting a piece of sport as I ever witnessed. We had some rifle shooting at geese and ducks, and Anderson slew a pan, the African bustard, and probably the best flavoured and most tender game that exists. John Morta cooked it with the utmost skill. I had returned from Yonkers on the 8th of February, and for 3 weeks we remained at Schmelin's Hope, waiting for the Damara chiefs, breaking in the oxen and hoping for the rains. It is a charming place, and almost a sufficiency of game was killed to feed us.